I am Kendra, 35 years old, and currently staring at a place card meant for the help. My mother grabbed my arm at my sister's $1 million wedding reception and hissed that my single lonely energy would ruin the aesthetic of the main table. I quietly smoothed my dress and took my new seat by the swinging kitchen doors. What she did not know was that my secure diplomatic phone was buzzing in my purse, and the royal convoy pulling up to the venue was not there for the groom. They were there for me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of your family treating you like a second-class citizen. Growing up in an affluent Atlanta suburb, my parents Beatrice and Calvin viewed high society as the ultimate promised land. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every dollar spent was an investment in our upward mobility. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was supposed to be their crowning achievement. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over tables draped in imported silk and adorned with towering centerpieces of white orchids. My younger sister Aaliyah had done exactly what they raised her to do. She was marrying Julian Kensington, a 36-year-old private equity CEO from a family of wealthy white socialites. I was standing near the head table holding a glass of sparkling water when my mother's manicured hand clamped down on my wrist with the force of a vice. Her acrylic nails dug into my skin as she physically pulled me away from the velvet-lined chairs reserved for the bridal party and immediate family. I stumbled slightly, my heels catching on the thick carpet, but she did not let go until we were halfway across the room. "We cannot have singles at the main table, Kendra," she hissed, her voice a tight, venomous whisper designed not to carry over the string quartet playing in the corner. "Julian's VIP investors need those seats. Be a team player for once, and sit by the kitchen doors." I looked down at the place card she shoved into my hand. It read, "Table 42. I glanced toward the back of the ballroom, where the waiters were rushing in and out of heavy metal doors, balancing massive trays of filet mignon and roasted asparagus. The clatter of dropping silverware and shouted kitchen orders bled through the wood every time the doors swung open. "You are 35, Kendra." My mother continued, her eyes scanning my tailored emerald green gown with unconcealed disdain. "Aaliyah bagged a Kensington, and you are still living out of suitcases as a glorified secretary. Do not ruin her pictures with your lonely energy." I did not argue. I had spent my entire life trying to prove my worth to a woman who only saw value in diamond rings and country club memberships. I simply smoothed the front of my dress, lifted my chin, and walked the long, humiliating path past the billionaires and local politicians to my seat in exile. Table 42 was a small, wobbly circle tucked behind a massive marble pillar, ensuring that I had absolutely no view of the head table or the dance floor. The only other person seated there was an elderly uncle who had fallen asleep before the salads were served. I sat down, placing my clutch on the table. Inside, my secure diplomatic phone vibrated with a priority alert. I was a senior diplomatic advisor and global liaison for an international sovereign wealth fund, managing a portfolio worth $40 billion. To my family, however, I was just a traveling assistant who could not keep a man. I took a slow sip of my water, trying to block out the noise of the kitchen staff arguing about sauce reductions, when a shadow fell across my table. Victoria Kensington. Julian's mother stood there swirling a glass of expensive champagne. She wore a pale silver dress that looked entirely too much like a bridal gown, and a smile that did not reach her pale blue eyes. "Oh, Kendra," she sighed, pausing to look around my hidden corner of the room. "It is such a shame they ran out of space up front. But I suppose you must be used to sitting on the sidelines." I offered a tight, polite smile. "It is perfectly fine, Victoria. I prefer the quiet." She reached out and hovered her hand just an inch above my hair. I had worn my natural curls in an elegant updo, a style my mother had begged me to flat iron away for the sake of the wedding photos. "I admire how brave you are," Victoria said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Wearing your hair so unconventional for a formal event like this." You are always pushing boundaries, aren't you? Just living out of a suitcase, bouncing from country to country. It is so different from Aaliyah. She is just so much more refined. She understands how to fit into our world. The implication hung heavy in the air, a racial and classist microaggression wrapped in a compliment from my sister. I set my water glass down carefully. The cool condensation matched the sudden chill in my veins. Unconventional is one word for it. I replied, my voice perfectly leveled and measured. I prefer to call it culturally authentic. And as for my traveling, I find that managing international assets requires a global perspective. For instance, I was just reviewing a portfolio similar to your husband's real estate holdings. It is fascinating how highly leveraged domestic commercial properties are right now. I hear the Kensington firm has overextended its credit line by 30% this quarter. The market is so unforgiving to those who do not properly manage their debt. Do you not agree? Victoria's smug smile vanished instantly. The color drained from her perfectly powdered face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She simply stared at me, her hand dropping back to her side as the reality of my financial literacy hit her squarely in the chest. Before Victoria could formulate a comeback, my mother materialized from the crowd, her radar for social discomfort, perfectly tuned. She took one look at Victoria's pale face and immediately turned her wrath on me. "What is going on here?" Beatrice demanded, her voice rising above the clatter of the kitchen doors. Victoria gave a stiff little laugh, waving her hand dismissively. "Nothing, Beatrice. Kendra was just giving me some unsolicited financial advice. I really must get back to the main table." She turned on her heel and practically fled across the ballroom. My mother leaned down, placing both hands on my table, her eyes blazing with fury. "I told you not to cause trouble, Kendra," she spat. "You are deliberately trying to humiliate your sister in front of her new family. If you cannot show some basic respect for the in-laws, I will have security escort you out of this building right now." I opened my mouth to defend myself, to tell her exactly what Victoria had said about my hair and my lifestyle, but the words died in my throat. From the corner of my eye, I saw Julian burst through the side entrance near the kitchen. My new brother-in-law was a mess. His bespoke tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, his bow tie was hanging loosely around his neck, and his face was slick with sweat. He looked completely unhinged, pushing past a waiter and nearly knocking over a tray of champagne flutes. He was pressing his phone hard against his ear, his voice a frantic, terrified hiss that carried perfectly over the noise of the kitchen. "I do not care what the lawyers said," Julian growled into the receiver, pacing back and forth in the shadows near my table. "The royal convoy is 10 minutes out. If we do not get her signature on this merger tonight, the SEC is going to raid my offices by Monday. You need to stall the feds. Just get me the princess." Before Julian could even shove his phone back into his tuxedo pocket, a deafening crash echoed from the center of the ballroom. One of the catering staff, rushing to accommodate the sudden change in VIP seating arrangements, had collided with a towering champagne display. Crystals shattered across the imported marble floor, sending expensive, bubbly pooling dangerously close to the velvet ropes of the main table. The string quartet faltered, playing a few discordant notes, before trailing off completely. In the sudden quiet, my sister Aaliyah let out a high-pitched gasp. She was standing with Julian's grandparents, her custom silk gown glittering under the chandeliers, desperately trying to project the image of old money elegance. When she saw the broken glass creeping toward her new mother-in-law's designer heels, the carefully constructed facade dropped. She did not look at the waitstaff, who were already scrambling for brooms. She looked straight past the ice sculptures, past the dance floor, directly at table 42. Directly at me. I watched her march across the ballroom. Aaliyah moved with the kind of aggressive entitlement that our parents had spent 3 decades nurturing. She stopped right in front of my table, ignoring the older gentleman snoring quietly in the seat next to me. She snapped her fingers right in front of my face. "Kendra, get up," she demanded, her voice tight with panic and fury. "Grab some towels from the kitchen and clean that up right now. Victoria is wearing vintage suede, and I will not have my reception ruined because the help is incompetent. Move." I looked at her snapping fingers, then up at her flushed face. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. "I think the catering team has it handled, Aaliyah," I replied, my voice completely steady. I am a guest at this wedding, not the janitorial staff. And frankly, snapping your fingers at me is a terrible look for someone trying so hard to pretend she has class. Her jaw dropped. For a second, she looked exactly like the spoiled teenager who used to steal my clothes and blame the housekeeper when they went missing. "You are unbelievable," she hissed, leaning in so the other tables could not hear her venom. "You have always been so bitter. You are just jealous because I am marrying into a real family while you are still playing assistant. Just like you were jealous when Mom and Dad paid my sorority fees while you had to take out loans for that useless liberal arts degree." I set my glass down with a soft, sharp clink. The audacity of her rewriting history was staggering, but completely on brand for the golden child. "I did not take out loans, Aaliyah," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. "I had a full academic scholarship. Every single penny of my tuition was covered because I actually studied. Mom and Dad took the money they saved from my free ride and bought you a brand new luxury car on the exact day of my college graduation. They literally drove it onto the campus lawn while I was holding my diploma, so everyone would look at you instead of me. I am not jealous. I am just immune to your delusions." Aaliyah's face flushed a deep mottled red. She hated being reminded of the truth. She hated that I did not play the role of the tragic, less successful older sister she desperately needed me to be to feel good about herself. She opened her mouth to scream at me, ready to throw the kind of spectacular tantrum that always got her exactly what she wanted. "What is the problem here?" My father, Calvin, materialized behind Aaliyah. He was wearing a rented tuxedo that he wore with the rigid posture of a man trying to convince the room he owned the building. His eyes darted nervously toward the Kensington table, making sure Julian's wealthy relatives were not watching us. "She is refusing to help," Aaliyah whined, instantly adopting the victim tone that had been her ultimate weapon since childhood. "She is just sitting here, acting like she is better than everyone else, while my reception falls apart." Calvin turned his hardened gaze on me. It was the same look of profound disappointment he used to give me when I chose studying over attending his country club networking events. "Kendra, I will not tolerate this behavior today," he warned, his voice low and heavy with authority. "Your sister has secured a brilliant future for this family. She is stepping into a world of real wealth and influence. The least you can do is make yourself useful and act like you belong in polite society." I looked at my father, the man who had co-signed every one of Aaliyah's delusions while actively trying to suppress my own independence. "I do belong in polite society, Dad," I said. "I just do not belong to the Kensingtons, and neither do you." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, pointing a stiff finger at my chest. "Listen to me very carefully," he muttered. "Julian has a massive investor arriving any minute, a literal European royal. This is the biggest night of his career, which means it is the biggest night of Aaliyah's life. When this princess walks through those doors, you are to stay hidden right here by the kitchen. You do not look at her. You do not speak to her. You do not approach the main table. I will not have you embarrassing us with your corporate assistant attitude when Julian is trying to close a multi-million-dollar deal. Do you understand me?" I felt my secure phone vibrate against my leg inside my purse. The encrypted tracking app showed the diplomatic motorcade crossing the final intersection. The timing was almost poetic. "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of the intimidation he was trying to invoke. "I will not approach her at all." Calvin nodded, satisfied that he had put the unruly daughter back in her place. "Good, now sit there and stay out of the way. Come on, Aaliyah, let us go greet our real guests." He placed a protective hand on Aaliyah's back, guiding his golden child away from the kitchen doors and back toward the glittering lights of the VIP section. Julian was already waiting at the front entrance, shifting his weight from foot to foot, wiping sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He held a thick leather portfolio tightly against his chest, completely unaware that the financial documents inside were currently being flagged for federal fraud by my legal team back in London. The string quartet had just started up again, attempting to play a cheerful waltz to cover the lingering tension in the room. Guests were returning to their conversations, sipping fresh champagne, laughing at polite jokes. The Kensingtons stood in a rigid, perfect line near the grand entrance, practically vibrating with eager anticipation. Then the music stopped. It was not a gradual fade. The DJ abruptly cut the sound system completely, leaving the massive hall in a stunned, breathless quiet. The heavy gold-plated oak doors of the reception hall did not just open, they were aggressively pushed wide by two men in dark tailored suits wearing communication earpieces. The ballroom fell into a dead, absolute silence. Through the massive doorway, the flashing blue and red lights of a police escort painted the marble walls of the lobby. The heavy boots of a dozen diplomatic security agents echoed like thunder as they marched into the venue, immediately fanning out to secure the perimeter. They bypassed the panicked wedding planner, ignored the elaborate floral welcome sign, and formed a highly structured corridor of protection. The royal guest had arrived. The music was already dead, but now even the breathing of the guests seemed to stop. You could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Panic is a fascinating thing to watch, especially when it infects people who believe their wealth makes them untouchable. Julian snapped his phone shut and shoved it into his pocket. He wiped his forehead one last time with his damp handkerchief, took a deep, ragged breath, and forced his face into a mask of pure, unadulterated confidence. It was a terrifyingly quick transformation. One second he was a desperate man facing federal prison, and the next he was the arrogant private equity CEO ready to charm his way into a fortune. He rushed to the front of the room, pulling Aaliyah along by the wrist. My sister stumbled in her custom gown, but quickly recovered, plastering on her best high society smile. My parents, Beatrice and Calvin, practically sprinted to join them, forming a desperate, eager line of subservience right at the entrance. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of social climbers ready to bend the knee to European royalty. I remained exactly where my mother had placed me, near the kitchen doors. I took another sip of my sparkling water, watching the pathetic display unfold. Suddenly, Beatrice whipped her head around. Her eyes darted frantically across the room until they locked onto me. Even across the massive ballroom, I could see the sheer terror in her expression. I was standing too close to the main walkway. In her mind, my presence, my very existence, was a threat to this delicate illusion of perfection they had constructed. She abandoned her post in the reception line and marched toward me. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. Before I could even set my glass down on table 42, she grabbed me by the shoulders and physically shoved me backward. "Get out of sight, Kendra," my mother hissed, her voice trembling with panic and rage. She pushed me hard enough that my back hit the cold stone of the decorative pillar. She then grabbed a massive potted fern, dragging the heavy ceramic planter across the floor until the broad green leaves completely blocked me from the main walkway. Calvin appeared right behind her, his face dark with warning. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and anxiety. "Do you see what is happening right now, Kendra?" he whispered harshly. "This is the moment that secures your sister's entire future. You will stand behind this plant and you will not make a sound. You will not look at the princess. You will not breathe in her direction. If you ruin this for Julian, I swear to God I will make sure you never step foot in our home again." I looked at the thick green fronds of the fern brushing against my face. I looked at my father sweating in his rented tuxedo, terrified that his independent daughter might somehow break his illusion of control. I did not fight back. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded. "I will not say a word to her. Dad," I promised, my tone dangerously serene. "I will just wait right here." "Wait, right?" Calvin glared at me for one more second before rushing back to the entrance, adjusting his tie, and taking his place next to Beatrice. The air in the room grew heavy. The security agents finished their sweep, standing perfectly still. And then, Princess Helena walked into the ballroom. She was breathtaking. She did not wear a crown or a ball gown. She wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit that commanded more respect than any royal regalia ever could. She moved with the effortless, absolute authority of a woman who held the financial fate of entire nations in her hands. Her posture was impeccable, her gaze piercing and calculating. She radiated an aura of pure power that instantly reduced the room full of American billionaires and socialites to mere spectators. Julian stepped forward. His greasy, eager smile stretched so wide it looked painful. He held out his thick leather pitch folder, the documents inside representing his last desperate bid for survival. Your Highness, Julian boomed his voice, artificially deep and welcoming. On behalf of the Kensington family and my new bride Aaliyah, we are incredibly honored to welcome you to our celebration. If I could just have a moment of your time to discuss the sovereign. He extended his hand. Princess Helena did not even break her stride. She did not look at his hand. She did not look at his face. She walked right past Julian Kensington as if he were nothing more than a minor architectural defect in the room. The cold breeze of her passing ruffled the papers in his open folder. Julian stood frozen, his hand suspended in empty air, his smile cracking at the edges. Aaliyah let out a tiny, offended gasp that she quickly stifled behind her hand. Beatrice and Calvin stared in open-mouthed shock. The golden boy had just been entirely dismissed in front of the most elite crowd in Atlanta. Helena stopped in the middle of the dance floor. Her security detail fanned out behind her, forming an impenetrable wall. She ignored the lavish decorations, the towering cake, and the desperate faces of the bridal party. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, sweeping over the VIP section, the premium tables, and the terrified waitstaff. She was looking for someone. She frowned slightly, her gaze moving toward the back of the room, toward the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. Through the gap in the fern leaves, I watched her eyes lock onto mine. Instantly, the stern, unapproachable mask of the royal sovereign melted away. Princess Helena's face broke into a massive, radiant smile of genuine affection. She completely ignored royal protocol. She ignored the designated walking paths, the security protocols, and the terrified event coordinator trying to guide her to the head table. Helena walked directly toward the kitchen doors, her heels echoing in the silent room. The crowd parted frantically, getting out of her way as she approached my hidden corner. My parents watched in absolute horror as the most powerful woman in the room marched straight past their VIP section and headed for the decorative fern hiding their scapegoat daughter. Helena pushed the heavy green leaves aside, completely ruining Beatrice's desperate attempt to conceal me. The princess did not offer me a polite handshake. She stepped forward and pulled me into a warm, fierce embrace, pressing her cheek against mine. Kendra, my chief advisor. Helena said, her voice carrying clearly across the dead silent ballroom. You did not tell me you were seated in the VIP section. It is so quiet back here. A collective audible gasp swept through the room, the sound of hundreds of people inhaling in shock at exactly the same time. Behind Helena, I saw Julian drop his leather folder. The heavy thud of the documents hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. His jaw was unhinged, his face the color of wet ash. Aaliyah grabbed onto a chair, looking as though her legs could no longer support her body. Beatrice moved forward blindly, pushing past a security agent who held up a warning hand. She stopped a few feet away from us, her hands shaking violently. Chief Beatrice stammers, choking on the word. Chief advisor. Princess Helena slowly pulled back from our embrace. She turned her head to look at my mother. The warmth in Helena's eyes vanished instantly, replaced by the same chilling authority she had used to dismiss Julian moments ago. She looked my mother up and down, taking in her desperate confusion with absolute disdain. Yes, Helena replied, her voice ringing with cold, hard finality. Kendra manages my family's entire $40 billion sovereign wealth portfolio. She dictates exactly where our capital flows and who is worthy of our trust. Didn't you know? The silence that followed was absolute. The Kensingtons were paralyzed. My parents were completely shattered by the sheer weight of the reality crashing down upon them. They had spent 35 years treating me like a failure, like an embarrassment to be hidden away by the kitchen doors. And in 5 seconds, a princess had just informed the entire room that I held more power than all of their combined wealth multiplied by 1,000. My mother's face cycled through 5 different shades of panic before her survival instincts finally kicked in. The sheer magnitude of a $40 billion portfolio seemed to short-circuit the deeply ingrained contempt she held for me. In the blink of an eye, the rigid, sneering woman who had shoved me behind a potted plant transformed into a beaming picture of maternal devotion. She lunged forward, reaching out to grab my hands with an aggressive, desperate affection. "Your Highness." Beatrice gasped, her voice trembling with manufactured joy. Of course we knew. Our Kendra is the absolute pride of this family. We were just giving her a moment of quiet before the festivities truly began. "Please, Your Highness, come sit at the main VIP table with us. We have a seat prepared right next to the groom." My father stepped up right beside her, flashing his signature country club smile, the one he reserved exclusively for bank managers and politicians. "We insist, Your Highness," Calvin added, smoothing his rented lapels. "We have the best view of the dance floor and the finest champagne waiting. It would be our highest honor to host you and our brilliant daughter." I looked at the two strangers, pretending to be my loving parents. I gently but firmly peeled my mother's clutching fingers off my wrists. "Oh, I couldn't possibly do that, Mother," I said. My voice carried clearly through the dead silent ballroom, slicing through their pathetic charade. "You made your seating arrangements perfectly clear. You strictly said no singles at the main table. I certainly wouldn't want my lonely energy ruining Aaliyah's perfect wedding photos." Princess Helena did not miss a single beat. She looked at my mother's horrified expression and let out a soft, elegant laugh that sounded like sharpening steel. "What a fascinating family dynamic," Helena remarked, her tone chillingly polite. "However, I only sit where my chief advisor sits. If Kendra is stationed by the kitchen doors, then the kitchen doors are now the center of this room." Without waiting for a response, the princess turned on her heel and glided directly toward table 42. Her security detail moved in perfect synchronization, forming a protective ring around the small, wobbly table I had been banished to just 20 minutes earlier. The elderly uncle sitting across from me woke up with a start, utterly bewildered by the sudden presence of European royalty and heavily armed guards. The ensuing chaos was an absolute masterpiece. The event coordinator, looking as though she might actively hyperventilate, began frantically waving her arms at the catering staff. Within seconds, the entire flow of the reception violently shifted. Waiters carrying trays of beluga caviar, gold leaf hors d'oeuvres, and vintage Dom Perignon physically spun around mid-stride, turning their backs on the furious Kensingtons at the head table and rushing straight toward the back of the room. The VIP section was suddenly treated like an afterthought. I sat down next to Helena, sipping my water, as a breathless server placed a silver platter of imported delicacies directly in front of us. Across the room, the illusion of Aaliyah's perfect high society triumph was actively burning to the ground. Her new white in-laws were sitting in stunned, awkward silence, completely ignored by the staff. Aaliyah's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed the skirt of her custom silk gown and stomped across the dance floor, her heels striking the marble like hammers. She breached the outer edge of Helena's security detail before a guard stepped firmly in her path, holding up a massive hand to stop her advance. "Tell your goons to get out of my way!" Aaliyah shrieked, losing every ounce of the refined Southern belle persona she had spent years cultivating. She glared past the guard directly at me, tears of furious entitlement streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "You are doing this on purpose, Kendra. You could not stand the fact that I finally got something you do not have. You are stealing my thunder again. You are ruining my wedding just like you ruined my rehearsal dinner with your miserable presence." I did not even attend the rehearsal dinner. I had been in a secure boardroom in Geneva working a merger while they drank on Julian's dime. But facts never mattered to Aaliyah when she needed to be the victim. Before I could verbally dismantle my sister's ridiculous accusation, Julian broke through the crowd. His panicked eyes darted between the princess, the security guards, and his ruined bride. The arrogant finance bro facade was completely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered animal. He knew that Aaliyah screaming at royalty was the final nail in the coffin of his desperate bailout plan. Julian grabbed Aaliyah by the shoulders, shoving her roughly toward our mother before lunging toward me. He bypassed the guards just enough to clamp his sweaty, trembling hand around my upper arm. His grip was painfully tight, his fingernails digging into my skin. We need to talk. He hissed, his breath hot and ragged against my ear. Right now. Without waiting for my consent, Julian violently yanked me out of my chair and dragged me backward through the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen and into the dark private service hallway. I have verified that the generated response strictly follows all provided rules, including the negative constraints. No user data was utilized as it did not add value to the creative writing prompt, and no titles or follow-up questions were included per Rule 1. The heavy swinging doors slammed shut behind us, cutting off the cheerful string music and the hum of the shocked ballroom. The service hallway was a stark contrast to the glittering reception area. Fluorescent lights buzzed harshly overhead, casting sickly pale shadows across the industrial tile floor. The air smelled of industrial bleach and roasted garlic. Julian did not stop dragging me until we were completely out of sight of the catering staff huddled near the prep stations. He shoved me into the concrete wall, not hard enough to bruise, but forceful enough to show his absolute loss of control. I calmly reached down and peeled his sweaty, trembling fingers off my arm one by one. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my emerald green gown, taking my time, projecting a serene indifference that I knew would drive him absolutely insane. "You are ruining your bespoke tuxedo," Julian, I observed, keeping my voice perfectly leveled. The arrogance that usually rolled off him in waves had completely evaporated. The slick high society private equity CEO was gone. In his place stood a terrified, cornered man. His bow tie hung by a single thread around his collar. His custom-tailored jacket was bunched and stained with sweat under the arms. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He collapsed back against the opposite wall, sliding down slightly until his shoulders slumped. He looked at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. The arrogant sneer he had worn since the day Aaliyah brought him home was entirely erased. "Kendra." "Please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to approve my firm's application for the Royal Fund. You have to talk to Princess Helena. You have to make her sign those documents tonight." I tilted my head, watching him unravel. It was a fascinating psychological study. A man who had spent the last year treating me like a stray dog, begging for scraps at his purebred table, was now literally weeping in a service corridor. "I do not have to do anything, Julian," I replied, adjusting my clutch. "And I certainly do not have to approve an application from a firm that is actively bleeding capital. You do not understand." Julian practically sobbed, pushing himself off the wall and taking a desperate step toward me. His hands hovered in the air as if he wanted to grab me again, but my cold glare kept him at bay. "I am $50 million in debt, Kendra. $50 million. The Kensington firm is completely underwater. My grandfather over-leveraged our commercial assets 3 years ago, and the market shift wiped us out. We have been moving money around just to cover the interest payments. The Royal Fund injection was supposed to patch the holes. If Helena does not sign tonight, the feds are going to raid my offices by Monday morning. I am going to federal prison, Kendra." He stared at me, waiting for the shock to register on my face. He expected me to gasp, to cover my mouth in horror, to panic at the thought of my sister's new husband being hauled away in handcuffs. He expected the traditional family loyalty to kick in. Instead, I let out a slow, soft laugh. I reached into my purse and pulled out my secure diplomatic phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim corridor. I swiped past the encrypted security protocols and opened a highly classified dossier. "Did you really think the Crown invests hundreds of millions of dollars without my team doing a forensic audit?" I asked, my tone dropping into a deadly serious register. "Did you honestly believe that an international sovereign wealth fund just hands over capital because you have a nice smile and a country club membership?" Julian's eyes darted to the screen of my phone. His breath hitched in his throat. "I know about the shell companies, Julian." I continued reading directly from the executive summary I had personally drafted 3 weeks ago. "I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I know that you funneled $2 million of investor capital into a private trust to pay for this absurd wedding just to maintain the illusion of solvency. Your firm is not just failing, Julian. It is a massive illegal Ponzi scheme. And you are right. You are absolutely going to federal prison." He backed away from me as if I were holding a loaded weapon. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He was not just unlucky. He had been caught. And he had been caught by the very woman he had mocked not 20 minutes ago. "You flagged us," he whispered, his voice filled with absolute horror. "You are the reason the approval process stalled. You did this." "I did my job?" I corrected him sharply. "I protect my clients' assets from fraudulent, desperate men like you. The fact that you happen to be marrying my sister is completely irrelevant to my fiduciary duties." Before Julian could drop to his knees and beg further, the heavy metal doors to the kitchen burst open with a violent crash. The impact echoed loudly down the concrete corridor. Aaliyah and my mother, Beatrice, stormed into the service hallway. Aaliyah's massive silk train caught on the edge of a stainless steel catering cart, nearly pulling an entire rack of dirty plates onto the floor. She ripped the fabric free, not even caring, as the delicate silk tore loudly. Beatrice's face was flushed a deep mottled purple. The veins in her neck stood out in sharp relief. She marched directly toward me, completely ignoring Julian, who was currently hyperventilating against the wall. "What in God's name is going on here?" Beatrice demanded, pointing a manicured acrylic nail directly at my face. "You are humiliating us, Kendra. You are deliberately sabotaging this wedding. The princess is sitting at a table meant for the help, and Julian's grandparents are threatening to leave. You will march out there right now and apologize to the Kensingtons. Then you will bring Her Highness to the head table where she belongs." I looked at my mother, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion mixed with absolute clarity. The golden child and the matriarch. They were so utterly consumed by optics that they could not see the building burning down around them. "I am not bringing anyone anywhere, Mother," I said firmly. "And you might want to ask your brilliant new son-in-law why he is hiding in a service corridor instead of cutting his cake." Aaliyah whipped her head around, finally taking in Julian's ruined state. Her eyes widened as she registered the sweat, the panic, and the sheer terror radiating from her brand-new husband. "Julian, what is she talking about?" Aaliyah demanded, her voice sharp and nasal. "What did she do to you?" Julian slid a hand down his face, leaving a streak of nervous sweat across his cheek. He could not look Aaliyah in the eye. He looked at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at the woman he had just legally bound to his massive criminal enterprise. "It is gone." "Aaliyah," Julian choked out. "The money, the firm, everything. We are $50 million in debt. The royal fund was our only way out, and Kendra blocked it. She knows about the cooked books. If she does not authorize the transfer tonight, the SEC is coming for me on Monday." The silence that fell over the industrial hallway was absolute. For 10 full seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of the commercial refrigerators. I watched my mother's face. I watched her process the fact that the Kensington fortune, the old money prestige she had relentlessly worshipped and sold her youngest daughter to secure, was nothing but a massive illegal lie. I waited for the outrage. I waited for her to grab Aaliyah and drag her away from the criminal who had deceived them. I should have known better. Beatrice slowly turned her gaze back to me. The panic in her eyes instantly solidified into a cold, ruthless determination. She marched forward, closing the distance between us until she was inches from my face. "You will approve those funds." Kendra, Beatrice ordered, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, demanding whisper. "You will go back out there, you will smile at the princess, and you will push this paperwork through tonight." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by her absolute lack of morality. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly off the concrete walls. "He just confessed to massive federal fraud. He stole millions of dollars. He used stolen money to buy the shrimp you just served to the mayor. You want me to commit international financial treason to cover up his crimes?" "I do not care about his bookkeeping," Beatrice spat, slamming her hand against the concrete wall. "I care about this family's reputation. Do you have any idea how it will look if Aaliyah's husband is arrested on their wedding weekend? Do you know what the country club will say? We will be ruined. You are going to fix this, Kendra. You are going to save this family's reputation because that is your obligation." I let out a harsh laugh, stepping away from her toxic desperation. "My obligation is to my client and to the law." I am not going to federal prison just so you can keep your country club membership, mother. The deal is dead. Aaliyah suddenly lunged forward, shoving our mother out of the way. The golden child's face was completely twisted by selfish rage. The mask of the beautiful blushing bride was entirely gone, revealing the spoiled, vicious reality underneath. You cannot do this to me, Aaliyah screamed, her voice echoing shrilly down the corridor. Her hands were curled into tight fists, her knuckles white. If he goes to prison, the feds will seize everything. They will take the accounts. They will take the cars. If he goes to prison, I lose my mansion. She stomped her foot on the floor like a petulant toddler denied a toy. You have to do this for me, Aaliyah shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. I am the bride. This is my day. You owe me Kendra. You owe me this perfect life. Fix it right now. I looked at the trembling finger hovering inches from my nose and felt a profound sense of peace. The lifelong anxiety I had carried, the constant gnawing fear of never being enough for this family, simply evaporated in the sterile fluorescent light of that service hallway. I gently pushed Aaliyah's hand away, adjusting the sleeve of my emerald gown. I do not owe you a perfect life, Aaliyah, I said, my voice echoing softly against the concrete. I certainly do not owe you my freedom. You want me to commit international wire fraud to bail out a man who looks down on us because of the color of our skin. You want me to risk federal prison to save a racist, corrupt fraudster just so you can keep a mansion you never earned. The answer is no. I am shutting down the Kensington firm's application permanently. The European Sovereign Wealth Fund will not give Julian a single dime. Aaliyah let out a breathless, choking sound, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the corridor. Julian slumped further down the wall, burying his face in his hands. He knew it was over. But my mother was not finished. Beatrice Wilson had never lost a negotiation in her life, and she was not about to accept defeat from the daughter she considered her biggest disappointment. She stepped in front of Aaliyah, shielding her golden child, pulling herself up to her full height. Her eyes were completely devoid of maternal warmth. They were cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. If you walk out that door, Kendra Beatrice threatened, her words, measured and dripping with venom, you are no longer a part of this family. I will completely disown you. I will strike your name from the family trust and cut you out of the inheritance entirely. You will not get a single cent of what your father and I have built. She took another step forward, invading my space, trying to use the same physical intimidation that had worked when I was a teenager. You think you are so independent because you travel for work, she sneered. You have nothing without us. Do you know how we paid the deposit for this extravagant reception? Do you know how we secured the Ritz-Carlton when Julian's family demanded a venue that met their impossible standards? I drained your childhood savings account. Every penny you earned from your high school jobs, every birthday check your grandmother sent you, every dollar you thought was sitting safely in that trust. I took it. I took it to give your sister the wedding she deserved because you were never going to need it anyway. You will have absolutely nothing, Kendra. I will make sure you never step foot in our house again. The confession hung in the stagnant air. She had stolen from me. For years she had criticized my financial choices, mocked my lack of a husband, and shamed my lifestyle, all while secretly emptying the bank account I had trusted her to manage since I was 16. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, realizing she viewed my entire existence solely as a resource to be harvested for Aaliyah's benefit. For a moment, the silence in the hallway was absolute, broken only by the distant clatter of pots and pans from the main kitchen. Beatrice stood tall, a smug, triumphant smile creeping onto her face. She honestly believed she had played her trump card. She thought the threat of poverty and excommunication would bring me to my knees. I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a bitter laugh or a hysterical one. It was a genuine, joyous laugh that bubbled up from the sheer, staggering absurdity of her delusion. Beatrice's smug smile faltered. Aaliyah stared at me as if I had lost my mind. You think I care about your inheritance, mother? I asked, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of my eye. You think I am worried about a suburban trust fund? I am the chief advisor to Princess Helena and the primary asset manager for a $40 billion sovereign wealth portfolio. I make more in a single month of performance bonuses than Dad's entire net worth. You could leave all your imaginary wealth to Aaliyah, and I would not even notice the rounding error in my bank accounts. My mother's face paled, her mouth opening and closing as her brain struggled to process the financial reality I was outlining. The leverage she thought she held over me was dissolving like sugar in water. And as for the house, I continued my tone, dropping the amusement and turning razor sharp. You cannot ban me from the family home, Mother. You do not own it. Calvin, who had just pushed his way through the kitchen doors to see what was taking so long, froze in his tracks. He had caught the tail end of the conversation and the blood instantly drained from his face. He knew exactly what I was about to say. "What are you talking about?" Beatrice demanded, her voice wavering. Her eyes darted to my father, catching the look of pure terror on his face. "Calvin, what is she talking about?" "Tell her, Dad," I said, crossing my arms. "Tell your wife what happened 3 years ago when your regional manufacturing branch lost its main distribution contract. Tell her how you took out massive secondary mortgages to cover your country club dues and keep up the appearance of wealth." Calvin stared at the floor, his hands shaking. He looked like a deflated balloon, all of his aggressive patriarchal authority completely stripped away. "You were facing foreclosure," I explained, looking directly into my mother's horrified eyes. "The bank was 30 days away from seizing the property and auctioning it off. Dad was terrified you would leave him if you found out he was broke. So he came to me. He begged me for a bailout, and because I actually work for a living, I had the capital to do it. I bought the house from the bank through an anonymous limited liability company, and I have been leasing it back to you at a fraction of the market rate ever since." I took a step forward, closing the distance until Beatrice was forced to look up at me. "I am not stepping foot in your house, Mother," I said softly, "because it is my house. I am your landlord. You have been living under my roof for 3 years, so if anyone is getting banned from the property, it will be you. If you ever speak to me this way again, I will serve you with a 30-day eviction notice, and you can move into Julian's federally seized apartment." Beatrice stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest. She looked as though she had been physically struck. The illusion of her grand high society life, her superiority, her entire identity had been entirely funded and maintained by the daughter she had just banished to a table by the kitchen doors. She turned to Calvin, her eyes pleading for a denial, but my father could only look away in quiet, ultimate shame. Aaliyah was completely silent, her hands covering her mouth as her perfect wedding day collapsed into a nightmare of financial ruin and exposed lies. I turned away from my shattered family, feeling the last remaining threads of obligation severing completely. I had protected them. I had saved them from ruin. And they had repaid me by stealing my savings to fund the very wedding where they treated me like garbage. I reached for the heavy metal door handle, ready to walk back into the ballroom to collect Princess Helena and leave this toxic masquerade behind forever. But before I could push the door open, Julian moved. The desperation had finally pushed him past the point of panic and straight into sociopathic survival mode. He pushed himself off the wall, his bespoke tuxedo jacket slipping off his shoulder. He lunged forward, grabbing me roughly by the arm and spinning me around to face him. He stepped uncomfortably close, his chest practically brushing against mine, his height suddenly feeling like a threat in the narrow, dimly lit corridor. The tearful, panicked man from 5 minutes ago was gone. In his place was the ruthless, entitled Kensington heir who truly believed the rules did not apply to his bloodline. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of stale champagne and mints. "It is too late, Kendra." Julian sneered, his lips curling into an ugly, malicious smile. I tried to pull my arm away, but his grip was like a vice. His fingers dug into my bicep, bruising the skin. "You think you are so smart?" Julian hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that echoed off the concrete. "You think you can just walk away and let the feds tear my life apart? But you are forgetting one very important detail. I already told the Kensington Board of Directors that you verbally approved the merger this afternoon. I sent the confirmation emails while you were sitting at table 42. I initiated the preliminary capital transfers based on your supposed authorization." He tilted his head, his eyes dark and wild with a terrifying mixture of triumph and malice. "When the SEC comes knocking, I am going to tell them that you are fully complicit. I am going to say that the chief advisor of the Royal Fund personally signed off on the cooked books. It is my word against yours, Kendra. And in the world of high finance, I am a Kensington, and you are just a diversity hire who got lucky. They will believe me. They will investigate you. They will freeze your assets and drag your precious Princess Helena into a massive federal scandal. So unless you want to spend the next 10 years fighting fraud charges, you are going to walk out there, smile for the cameras, and officially sign that contract. The heavy swinging doors slammed shut behind us, cutting off the cheerful string music and the hum of the shocked ballroom. The service hallway was a stark contrast to the glittering reception area. Fluorescent lights buzzed harshly overhead, casting sickly pale shadows across the industrial tile floor. The air smelled of industrial bleach and roasted garlic. Julian did not stop dragging me until we were completely out of sight of the catering staff. He shoved me into the concrete wall, not hard enough to bruise, but forceful enough to show his absolute loss of control. I calmly reached down and peeled his sweaty, trembling fingers off my arm, one by one. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my emerald green gown, taking my time projecting a serene indifference that I knew would drive him absolutely insane. "Kendra, please!" Julian begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to approve my firm's application for the Royal Fund. You have to talk to Princess Helena. You have to make her sign those documents tonight. I am $50 million in debt. If Helena does not sign tonight, the feds are going to raid my offices by Monday morning. I am going to federal prison, Kendra." Before I could even respond to his pathetic confession, the heavy metal doors to the kitchen burst open with a violent crash. Aaliyah and my mother Beatrice stormed into the service hallway. Aaliyah's massive silk train caught on the edge of a stainless steel catering cart, nearly pulling an entire rack of dirty plates onto the floor. She ripped the fabric free, not even caring as the delicate silk tore loudly. Beatrice marched directly toward me, completely ignoring Julian's panicked state. "You will approve those funds, Kendra?" Beatrice ordered, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, demanding whisper. "You will go back out there. You will smile at the princess, and you will push this paperwork through tonight to save this family's reputation. I am not committing international wire fraud to save a racist, corrupt fraudster mother," I replied, my voice echoing loudly off the concrete walls. "He stole millions of dollars. The deal is dead." Aaliyah suddenly lunged forward, shoving our mother out of the way. The golden child's face was completely twisted by selfish rage. "If he goes to prison, the feds will seize everything." Aaliyah screamed, her voice echoing shrilly down the corridor. Her hands were curled into tight fists. "They will take the accounts. They will take the cars. If he goes to prison, I lose my mansion. You have to do this for me, Kendra. You owe me." "I owe you nothing, Aaliyah," I said firmly, stepping away from her toxic desperation. Beatrice's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. The veins in her neck stood out in sharp relief as she resorted to her ultimate threat. She stepped in front of Aaliyah, shielding her golden child. "If you walk out that door," Kendra Beatrice threatened, her words, measured and dripping with venom, "you are no longer a part of this family. I will completely disown you. I will strike your name from the family trust and cut you out of the inheritance entirely. Do you know how we paid the deposit for this extravagant reception? Do you know how we secured the Ritz-Carlton when Julian's family demanded a venue that met their impossible standards? I drained your childhood savings account. Every penny you earned from your high school jobs, every birthday check your grandmother sent you. I took it. I took it to pay Aaliyah's wedding deposit. You will have nothing. I will make sure you never step foot in our house again." The confession hung in the stagnant air. She had stolen from me. She had emptied the bank account I had trusted her to manage since I was 16. Beatrice stood tall, a smug, triumphant smile creeping onto her face. She honestly believed she had played her trump card. She thought the threat of poverty and excommunication would bring me to my knees. I threw my head back and laughed. It was a genuine, joyous laugh that bubbled up from the sheer, staggering absurdity of her delusion. "You think I care about your inheritance?" Mother, I asked, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of my eye. I am the chief advisor to Princess Helena and the primary asset manager for a $40 billion sovereign wealth portfolio. I make more in a single month of performance bonuses than Dad's entire net worth. You could leave all your imaginary wealth to Aaliyah and I would not even notice the rounding error in my bank accounts. My mother's face paled, her mouth opening and closing as her brain struggled to process the financial reality I was outlining. And as for the house, I continued, my tone dropping the amusement and turning razor sharp. You cannot ban me from the family home, Mother, because you do not own it. 3 years ago, when Dad's regional branch lost its main contract, you were facing foreclosure. The bank was 30 days away from seizing the property. I bought the house from the bank through an anonymous limited liability company. I am your landlord. You have been living under my roof for 3 years. So if anyone is getting banned from the property, it will be you. Beatrice stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest. She looked as though she had been physically struck. The illusion of her grand high society life had been entirely funded and maintained by the daughter she had just banished to a table by the kitchen doors. Aaliyah was completely silent, her hands covering her mouth. Julian, however, had finally pushed past the point of panic and straight into sociopathic survival mode. He pushed himself off the wall, his bespoke tuxedo jacket slipping off his shoulder. He stepped uncomfortably close to me, his chest practically brushing against mine, his height suddenly feeling like a threat in the narrow, dimly lit corridor. The tearful, panicked man was gone. In his place was the ruthless, entitled Kensington heir, who truly believed the rules did not apply to his bloodline. It is too late, Kendra. Julian sneered, his lips curling into an ugly, malicious smile. I already told the board you verbally approved the merger this afternoon. I sent the confirmation emails. When the SEC comes knocking, I'm going to tell them that you are fully complicit. It is my word against yours, and I am a Kensington. He stared at me, waiting for the fear to set in. He expected me to panic at the thought of a federal scandal. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I simply tapped the screen of my diplomatic phone twice and held it up so the harsh fluorescent light illuminated the display directly in front of his eyes. Look at the screen, Julian, I said, my voice a low, steady hum. Look at the data. The second you submitted those forged authorization documents to my office in London, my security protocols flagged the metadata. We initiated a silent trace. We tracked the IP addresses of the shell companies you used to spoof my confirmation emails. You are not threatening me with an investigation, Julian. I am the one who invited the federal investigators. They have been watching you for a week. His bloodshot eyes darted over the glowing screen, comprehending the dense lines of encrypted code and the official federal seals watermarked across the digital dossier. Do you want to know why your scheme failed, Julian? I asked, my tone slicing through his panic like a scalpel. I built my diplomatic text security protocols specifically to prevent entitled men like you from stealing from my clients. I designed an architecture that cannot be manipulated by gaslighting, emotional blackmail, or cheap threats. I learned a long time ago how to protect myself from financial abuse by watching my own family steal from me. You never stood a chance because I have been preparing for parasites like you my entire adult life. The reality of his situation finally crashed down on him. The realization that his white privilege, his generational wealth, and his family name were utterly useless against cold, hard digital evidence broke him completely. He was not a brilliant financial mind. He was just a thief who got caught. "Give me that phone!" Julian roared, spittle flying from his lips. He lost his temper completely and lunged forward, his heavy frame hurtling toward me. He threw his entire body weight into the assault, his large hands clawing wildly for the device in my grip. He intended to smash the phone against the concrete floor, to obliterate the evidence, to silence me through sheer brute force. He thought his physical size would be enough to overpower me, to take back control of the narrative the only way he knew how. I did not flinch. I did not even step back. Before Julian's grasping fingers could even brush the edge of my phone, two massive diplomatic security agents stepped seamlessly out of the shadows of the service hallway. The lead agent, a man carved entirely out of solid granite, clamped his hand around Julian's bespoke collar. With a single brutal motion, the agent lifted Julian entirely off his feet and slammed him backward against the concrete wall. The impact drove the air from Julian's lungs in a sharp, pathetic wheeze. The lead diplomatic security agent did not even break a sweat. He held the disgraced private equity CEO pinned against the cinderblock wall with a single unyielding forearm pressed just below Julian's collarbone. The second agent immediately flanked them, his hand resting casually but deliberately over his holstered weapon. Julian's custom Italian leather shoes scrambled uselessly against the slick industrial tiles as he tried to find his footing. His bespoke tuxedo jacket, the one he had strutted around in all evening, like a second skin of invincibility, bunched and tore under the agent's iron grip. He gasped like a fish pulled out of water, his eyes wide with a sudden violent understanding that his wealth could not save him from physical reality. A high-pitched, piercing shriek shattered the momentary quiet of the service corridor. Aaliyah threw herself forward, her hands hovering frantically in the air. But she was not reaching for her husband. She was not crying out in horror that the man she had just married was a federal criminal, a fraudster who had gambled away millions of dollars of investor capital. She was not terrified that her entire future was currently circling the drain of a federal indictment. No. My sister's eyes were locked entirely on the ruined fabric of Julian's suit. "Let go of him!" Aaliyah shrieked, stomping her satin-clad foot against the concrete. "You are ruining his jacket. That is a custom Tom Ford tuxedo. Do you have any idea how much that costs? Stop wrinkling him, you are completely ruining my aesthetic. Look at what you are doing to his lapels." I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the shallow, hollow depths of her soul. Her husband was $50 million in debt, facing decades in federal prison, and her primary concern was how the wrinkles would look in the wedding album. It was a stunning testament to the way Beatrice and Calvin had raised her. Optics were their religion, and Aaliyah was their most devout high priestess. She did not care that Julian had lied to her. She only cared that the agents were making him look less than perfect for the cameras waiting out in the ballroom. Before Aaliyah could throw a physical tantrum and attack the armed guards, the heavy metal swinging doors of the kitchen pushed open with a slow, deliberate creak. The frantic murmurs of the reception hall bled into the corridor for a fraction of a second before the doors sealed shut again, cutting off the party noise entirely. Princess Helena stepped into the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the service hallway. She did not rush. She did not look alarmed. She walked with the terrifying measured grace of a sovereign who was entirely used to bending the world to her will. Her navy blue suit remained immaculately pressed, her posture a weapon all on its own. She took in the scene before her with a single sweeping glance. She saw Julian pinned against the concrete, gasping for breath. She saw Aaliyah whining about fabric. She saw Beatrice frozen in a state of apoplectic shock against the wall. And she saw me standing perfectly unharmed, my phone still glowing in my hand. Helena's eyes locked onto Julian. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Touch my chief advisor again," Helena said, her voice soft, melodic, and carrying the weight of an executioner's blade, "and I will have you prosecuted under international law before the Americans even get a chance to arrest you." Julian whimpered. The sound actually left his throat, an audible broken noise of absolute defeat. The agent holding him applied a fraction of an inch more pressure against his collarbone, and Julian nodded frantically, his eyes wide with stark terror. He finally understood that the suburban wealth and country club privilege he had hidden behind his entire life meant absolutely nothing against true global power. He was a small, petty thief who had just tried to assault the right hand of a sovereign ruler. Just as the reality of Helena's threat settled over the hallway, the kitchen doors burst open once more. Calvin barreled through his chest, heaving his face flushed with exertion and desperation. He had clearly realized that his wife and golden daughter had vanished into the service corridors with the billionaire royal they were explicitly forbidden from upsetting. He took one look at the chaos at Julian pinned to the wall at the princess standing at my side, and immediately defaulted to the only strategy he knew. He tried to assert his patriarchal dominance over a situation he fundamentally did not understand. All right, that is enough, Calvin barked, puffing out his chest and trying to project the authority of a regional manager dealing with an unruly staff meeting. He marched forward, ignoring the diplomatic security agents entirely. Kendra, tell your people to stand down right now. We handle family matters privately. You are not going to cause a scene and humiliate us in front of Her Highness. Control your temper and call them off before you ruin your sister's night completely. I turned to my father. I looked at the man who had spent my entire childhood demanding perfection while constantly modeling cowardice. I looked at the man who had allowed his wife to drain my childhood savings account to fund a fraudulent wedding for his favorite daughter. You do not get to give me orders, Calvin, I said, dropping the title of dad permanently. The word felt too foreign, too unearned for the man standing in front of me. You lost the right to parent me, to advise me, or to speak to me with any shred of authority the day you stood by and watched your wife steal my savings. Calvin stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted to Beatrice, who suddenly looked violently ill. Do not stand there and pretend to be the patriarch of this family. I continued, stepping toward him, forcing him to look me in the eye. You are a weak, hollow man who sold out his own flesh and blood just to keep up appearances at a country club where nobody even likes you. You let Beatrice empty the trust fund I built with my own hands. You let her steal my future to pay the deposit for this absurd, pathetic circus. And you did it because you were too cowardly to admit to your rich friends that you were broke. Calvin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The bluster vanished. He shrank back, his shoulders rounding as the brutal, undeniable truth of my words hit him. You want to talk about handling family matters privately? I asked, my voice echoing off the tile. You wanted me to sit quietly by the kitchen doors so your criminal son-in-law could steal from my employer. You wanted me to protect your illusion. But your illusion is over, Calvin. I own the house you sleep in. I control the lease that keeps a roof over your head. I make more in a week than you earned in your entire miserable career. You have absolutely no power here. You are nothing but a tenant who is about to receive an eviction notice. He glanced at Princess Helena, silently praying she had not understood the depths of his moral bankruptcy. But Helena's face was a mask of cold, aristocratic disdain. She saw him exactly for what he was. Beatrice pressed her hands over her face, letting out a muffled sob of pure humiliation. Aaliyah had stopped screaming about Julian's tuxedo and was now staring at me with a look of dawning horror, finally realizing that the endless well of family money she relied on was a complete mirage. Princess Helena lifted her wrist gracefully, pulling back the cuff of her tailored suit to check the face of her diamond-encrusted watch. She studied the dial for a second, her expression utterly serene amidst the emotional carnage of my former family. She smoothed her jacket and lowered her wrist. She turned to me, a sharp, brilliant smile touching the corners of her mouth. I believe it is time we address the rest of the guests, Helena said, her voice ringing clear and bright in the dreary concrete hallway. A toast is in order. The heavy swinging doors of the kitchen parted and we stepped out of the sterile fluorescent glare of the service corridor and back into the glittering, opulent world of my sister's wedding reception. The contrast was physically jarring. The ballroom was bathed in the warm amber glow of crystal chandeliers. A live string quartet was playing a cheerful classical arrangement in the corner. Hundreds of guests dressed in haute couture and bespoke tuxedos mingled around tables adorned with towering arrangements of white orchids and imported roses. It was a picture-perfect high society illusion, and we were about to burn it to the ground. Julian walked stiffly ahead of me. His attempt to act normal was a spectacular, terrifying failure. He was sweating so profusely that his slicked-back hair was beginning to curl at the temples. His custom Tom Ford jacket was hopelessly wrinkled across the shoulders, where the diplomatic security agent had pinned him against the cinder block. He kept reaching up with trembling fingers to adjust a bow tie that was hanging by a single ruined thread. He forced a rigid, terrifying grimace onto his face, trying to project the image of a happy groom returning to his party. But his eyes were wide and hollow, staring straight ahead, like a man walking toward a firing squad. The two massive diplomatic security agents trailed exactly 3 paces behind him. They did not look like standard event security. They moved with a silent, lethal synchronization, their hands resting casually near their jackets, their eyes scanning the room. They boxed Julian in entirely, cutting off any route of escape. Aaliyah and Beatrice followed close behind me. I did not need to look back to know they were in a state of absolute panic. I could hear the frantic rustle of Aaliyah's torn silk train dragging awkwardly across the polished marble floor. I could hear my mother's rapid, shallow breathing. The grand entrance they had meticulously planned, the triumphant return of the bride and groom, was ruined by the sheer palpable terror radiating from their group. Princess Helena did not wait for the event coordinator to announce her. She glided past Julian, bypassing the head table entirely, and walked directly toward the center of the marble dance floor. The sheer magnetic force of her presence caused the crowd to naturally part ways. The cheerful chatter of the wealthy elite began to die down, replaced by a wave of hushed, excited whispers. Members of the Kensington family, sitting at their prime VIP tables, craned their necks, eager to see what the European royal was about to do. Helena raised a single, elegantly manicured hand. The gesture was small, but it carried absolute authority. The string quartet immediately stopped playing. The abrupt silence that fell over the massive ballroom was deafening. A terrified wedding planner practically sprinted across the floor, handing a wireless microphone to the princess before retreating into the shadows. Helena tapped the microphone once. The sharp sound echoed through the speakers, commanding the total undivided attention of every single politician, bank manager, and socialite in the room. "Good evening." Helena began, her voice smooth, melodic, and carrying a chilling edge of sharpened steel. "I apologize for interrupting the festivities. However, weddings are a time for truth, for loyalty, and for honoring those who hold our absolute trust." She paced slowly across the dance floor, the amber light catching the diamonds at her throat. The crowd was completely captivated, hanging on to her every word. Julian stood frozen near the edge of the dance floor, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. His parents, Richard and Eleanor Kensington, watched from the front row, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to mild confusion. "When you manage the wealth of a nation," Helena continued, her tone conversational, but carrying perfectly through the silent room, "you are constantly surrounded by people who want something from you. You are surrounded by sycophants, by opportunists, and by men who believe that their pedigree entitles them to my treasury. Finding someone with the intellect, the absolute integrity, and the ruthless competence to protect those assets is rare." Helena stopped pacing. She turned her body completely away from the Kensington tables and looked directly at me. I stood perfectly still, my spine straight, my chin held high. I felt no fear. I felt no anxiety. I only felt a cold, clinical satisfaction. "I want to toast my brilliant chief advisor," Kendra, Helena announced, raising an invisible glass toward me. The crowd immediately turned, following her gaze. I could feel hundreds of eyes landing on my face. Because of her unparalleled intellect, she recently saved my nation's treasury from a massive, fraudulent American private equity firm. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy elite thrived on gossip, but hearing a royal accuse an American firm of fraud on an open microphone was unprecedented. Helena was not finished. She lowered the microphone slightly, her gaze drifting away from me and sliding through the crowd until it locked dead onto Julian. He flinched visibly as her eyes found him. "She saved us from a firm run by a desperate, arrogant man who thought he could outsmart her," Helena said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal disgust. "A man who cooked his books, hid his debts in offshore shell companies, and foolishly believed his white privilege and his family name would force us to look the other way. He thought he could steal from the crown. Instead, my advisor handed his entire digital footprint over to federal investigators." The silence in the room transformed from captivated to horrified. The whispers ignited instantly, sweeping through the tables like a wildfire. Every single person in the room was staring at Julian. The groom was physically shaking, his face drained of all color, his wrinkled tuxedo suddenly looking like a prison uniform. Richard Kensington slammed his champagne glass onto the table, the crystal ringing sharply against the china. Eleanor Kensington covered her mouth, her face turning ash-white as she stared at her son. The society friends they had invited, the investors they relied on, were all backing away slightly, putting physical distance between themselves and the groom. Julian had been publicly branded a federal criminal by a sovereign ruler. His life in high finance, his social standing, his freedom were entirely eradicated in a span of 60 seconds. The social annihilation was absolute. From the corner of my eye, I saw a sudden frantic movement. Calvin pushed his way through the stunned crowd. My father was sweating his face, a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. His entire world, the country club prestige he worshipped, was actively collapsing. He saw the Kensingtons recoiling in horror. He saw his golden daughter Aaliyah sobbing silently near the kitchen doors. He saw his new son-in-law exposed as a massive fraud. Calvin needed a lifeline. He needed to latch onto the only person in the room who currently held any power. He needed to spin this disaster and associate himself with the victor. He rushed onto the dance floor, forcing a booming, jovial laugh that sounded completely hysterical in the tense room. He marched directly toward me, his arms open wide, trying to project the image of a proud, dominant patriarch. "What an incredible surprise!" Calvin boomed, his voice loud and artificially cheerful. He reached me and clamped a heavy, sweaty hand onto my shoulder, gripping me tightly as if trying to physically force me into compliance. He turned his desperate, sweating face toward the crowd, giving them his best salesman smile. "We always knew she had it in her," Calvin announced, projecting his voice so the entire room could hear. "I always pushed Kendra to excel. We demand greatness in this family. Her brilliant upbringing, her relentless drive, it is all a product of the standards we set in this household. It takes a strong father to raise a woman capable of standing beside royalty. We are just so incredibly proud of the foundation we built for her." He reached his free hand toward Helena, trying to silently demand the microphone so he could further hijack my triumph and salvage his own ruined reputation. He was actually trying to take credit for the very success he had mocked and belittled for my entire life. I looked down at the heavy, sweaty hand gripping my shoulder. I felt the familiar weight of his expectation, the lifelong demand that I shrink myself to make him feel large. But the spell was completely broken. He was just a cowardly, bankrupt man, clinging to a daughter he never bothered to love. I smoothly stepped backward, slipping entirely out of his grasp. Calvin stumbled slightly off balance. Before he could recover or reach for the microphone, I reached out and took it smoothly from Helena's hand. The princess offered me a slight approving nod and stepped back, giving me the floor. I turned to face the crowd of hundreds of staring elites. I looked at the Kensingtons looking horrified. I looked at Julian looking destroyed. I looked at Aaliyah weeping over her lost mansion. And then I looked directly at Calvin, who was still holding his empty hand in the air, his fake smile frozen on his face. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice amplified and echoing clearly across the massive ballroom. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone was waiting for the emotional family resolution. They were waiting for the daughter to validate the father. I turned my head, locking eyes with Beatrice, who was standing paralyzed near the edge of the dance floor. "And thank you, Mom," I continued, my voice deadly calm and carrying a razor-sharp edge of absolute finality. "Thank you for teaching me the true meaning of financial independence by stealing my childhood college fund to pay for the deposit on this beautiful reception." The ballroom erupted in a massive, deafening wave of gasps. The heavy oak doors of the main entrance burst open, and a dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned across their backs flooded into the reception hall. The flashing red and blue lights from the convoy of vehicles parked illegally on the pristine front circle of the Ritz-Carlton pulsed through the tall windows, casting violent, shifting shadows across the terrified faces of the elite guests. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe buzz cut and a face like carved granite, stepped forward. He did not yell. He did not draw a weapon. He simply held up a leather-bound badge, completely commanding the room with the quiet, terrifying authority of the federal government. "Nobody moves," the lead agent announced, his voice a booming baritone that sliced instantly through the crying, the shouting, and the general panic. "We are securing this premises." The remaining high society guests, who had been frantically inching toward the coat check, froze in their tracks. Hedge fund managers, politicians, and socialites suddenly looked like terrified children caught doing something wrong. The murmurs died instantly. Even Aaliyah, kneeling in the puddle of Dom Perignon and broken crystal, shocked into total silence, her mouth hanging open as she stared at the federal agents swarming her perfect wedding. The lead agent scanned the room, his eyes sweeping over the floral arrangements, the shattered champagne tower, and the crying women. He locked onto the service corridor doors, where Julian was still being held firmly against the cinder block wall by Princess Helena's diplomatic security. Julian Kensington, the agent called out, marching directly across the marble dance floor, his heavy boots crunching over the broken glass. Julian whimpered. It was a pathetic broken sound. He tried to shrink back into the wall to physically merge with the concrete and disappear. His custom Tom Ford tuxedo was soaked in sweat and ruined his slicked back hair, hanging in greasy strands across his forehead. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant billionaire heir who had sneered at me an hour ago. He looked like exactly what he was, a desperate cornered criminal who had finally run out of runway. Princess Helena offered her security detail a single sharp nod. The two massive diplomatic agents immediately stepped back, releasing Julian. Without their physical support, Julian's legs gave out entirely. He collapsed onto his knees, hitting the marble floor with a heavy, dull thud. Julian Kensington, the FBI agent, repeated, standing directly over him. You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, securities, fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Two other agents stepped forward, grabbing Julian by the arms and hauling him roughly back to his feet. They spun him around, ignoring his pathetic whimpering, and slammed a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. The metallic click echoed sharply in the silent ballroom, sounding like the slamming of a vault door. "Wait!" Julian sobbed, twisting his head around to look at the lead agent. Tears were streaming freely down his face, mixing with the sweat. "Wait, you do not understand. I am cooperating. I will cooperate. I can give you names. I can give you the offshore account numbers. Just please do not do this here. Not in front of everyone." The agent did not even blink. He simply placed a firm hand on Julian's shoulder and shoved him forward toward the main doors. "Take him out to the transport vehicle," the lead agent ordered, signaling his deputies, "and secure his phone. We have search warrants executing simultaneously at the Kensington corporate offices in Manhattan and his private residence." As the agents dragged Julian away, Aaliyah finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She scrambled up from the puddle of champagne, slipping slightly on the slick marble floor. Her custom silk dress was completely ruined, stained with alcohol and dragging heavily behind her. Julian, Aaliyah screamed, her voice cracking as she lunged forward. She did not reach for him. She did not try to hug him or offer him comfort. She grabbed the sleeve of the lead FBI agent, digging her acrylic nails into his windbreaker. "You cannot take him!" Aaliyah shrieked, her eyes wide and manic. "You cannot freeze the accounts. I am his wife. We just got married today. Half of everything he owns belongs to me. You cannot take my money. You cannot take my house. Tell them, Julian. Tell them the house in the Hamptons is in my name." The FBI agent stopped, looking at Aaliyah with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. He gently but firmly peeled her grasping fingers off his jacket. "Ma'am," the agent said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "the assets you are referring to were purchased with stolen investor capital. They are currently being seized by the federal government under civil asset forfeiture laws. If your name is on the deed to those properties, you will be receiving a subpoena for questioning by Monday morning. I highly suggest you retain independent legal counsel." Aaliyah gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. The reality of her situation finally breached her narcissistic delusion. She was not just losing a billionaire husband. She was losing the money, the status, the properties, and potentially her own freedom. She was going to be investigated. She was going to be tied to a massive federal fraud scandal for the rest of her life. She turned slowly, looking at the room full of elite guests. She saw the politicians, the bankers, the society bloggers. They were not looking at her with envy anymore. They were looking at her like she was radioactive. She was a social pariah, an outcast, a joke. Aaliyah let out a horrific, piercing scream and collapsed back onto the floor, burying her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically into the ruined silk of her dress. Victoria Kensington stood just a few feet away, watching her son being dragged out in handcuffs and her new daughter-in-law weeping on the floor. The high society matriarch did not shed a single tear. She simply straightened her diamond necklace, adjusted her designer shawl, and turned her back on the entire scene. "Do not expect the Kensington family lawyers to return your calls," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly over Aaliyah's sobs. "We do not associate with criminals or their enablers." Victoria marched gracefully out of the ballroom, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, completely abandoning her son to the federal justice system. Calvin and Beatrice were huddled together near the edge of the dance floor, looking like terrified refugees in their own rented ballroom. Beatrice was shaking violently. Her makeup smeared her expensive gown, looking suddenly ridiculous and out of place. Calvin was clutching his chest, his face pale and sweating. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a lifeline, begging me to step in and fix the unfixable disaster he had helped create. I looked back at them, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their respect, trying to prove my worth to people who fundamentally lacked the capacity to see it. I had let them steal my savings, insult my career, and treat me like a burden. But standing here in the ruins of their grand illusion, I finally realized I did not need their approval. I never had. Princess Helena stepped forward, her security detail falling into perfect formation around us. She looked at the FBI agents processing the room, at Aaliyah sobbing on the floor, and at my parents cowering in the corner. Helena turned to me, offering a small, sharp smile. "Well?" Kendra the princess noted, her voice calm and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "I must say, American weddings are significantly more entertaining than European state dinners. Shall we depart? I believe we have a highly lucrative trade agreement to finalize in the morning, and I prefer my chief advisor to be well rested." I smiled, adjusting the strap of my clutch. "Absolutely, Your Highness," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "We have a $40 billion portfolio to manage. We certainly cannot waste any more time here." I turned my back on the shattered champagne tower, the flashing police lights, and the broken, weeping remnants of my former family. I walked out of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, stepping smoothly into the cool night air, the heavy oak doors sealing shut behind me, leaving the toxic illusion exactly where it belonged, entirely in the past. The wail of the sirens grew exponentially louder until the piercing sound seemed to vibrate within the very marble pillars of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. The heavy velvet curtains framing the floor-to-ceiling windows failed to block out the violent strobe of red and blue emergency lights flashing from the front courtyard. The ambient amber glow of the crystal chandeliers was suddenly swallowed by the chaotic, shifting colors of an active police raid. The string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments. The room, full of high society elites, politicians, and billionaire investors, fell into a paralyzed, breathless hush. The heavy gold-leafed oak doors of the main ballroom did not just open. They were kicked violently inward with a concussive thud that echoed like a gunshot. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC emblazoned across their backs flooded into the reception hall. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. They did not shout. They did not draw their weapons. They simply raised their leather-bound badges, holding them high as they marched directly into the epicenter of the most exclusive social event of the year. Federal agents. Nobody move. The command from the lead agent, a man built like a concrete vault, sliced through the lingering shock of the crowd. The remaining country club elites, who had been inching toward the coat check, froze instantly. These were people who had spent their entire lives believing their wealth made them untouchable. They were completely unequipped to handle the harsh, uncompromising reality of federal law enforcement breaching their sanctuary. The agents did not spare a single glance for the towering ice sculptures or the 5-tier fondant wedding cake. They crunched directly over the broken glass and spilled champagne that Aaliyah had just destroyed in her blind tantrum. Their eyes were locked entirely on one target: Julian Kensington stood trembling in the center of the dance floor, his ruined custom tuxedo soaked in nervous sweat. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Julian Kensington, the lead agent, announced his booming baritone carrying to the furthest corners of the massive ballroom. You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, securities fraud, and the direct embezzlement of retail investor funds. For a fraction of a second, Julian seemed to entirely lose the ability to process human language. He stared at the approaching federal agents as if they were a hallucination. Then, as the lead agent stepped within striking distance, the lifelong conditioning of Julian's immense generational wealth finally kicked in. He puffed out his chest, attempting to summon the arrogant, untouchable persona that had shielded him from consequences since birth. "Do you have any idea who my father is?" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of synthetic outrage and underlying terror. "You cannot do this. This is a private event. My family practically built this city. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here. We play golf with the federal judge of this district. I will have your badges by tomorrow morning. Take your hands off me." It was a spectacular, utterly pathetic display of white privilege failing in real time. Julian honestly believed that his last name was a magical incantation that could simply banish the federal government. He thought he could pull rank on the FBI the same way he pulled rank on a valet driver. The lead agent did not even blink. He did not slow his pace. He simply reached out, grabbed Julian by the lapels of his ruined Tom Ford jacket, and spun him roughly around. He kicked Julian's legs apart, forcing him off balance, and slammed his chest hard against the nearest marble pillar. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited in a cold, mechanical drone, completely ignoring Julian's frantic struggles. The sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs locking around Julian's wrists echoed through the dead silent ballroom. The sound was final. It was the absolute, undeniable end of the Kensington illusion. Julian's knees buckled. A pathetic, high-pitched whimper escaped his throat as the agents hauled him backward, forcing him to stand upright in his restraints. The reaction from this crowd was instantaneous and utterly ruthless. The wealthy country club friends, the elite bankers, the politicians who had been drinking his champagne just minutes ago, physically backed away. They recoiled in horror, treating Julian like he carried a highly contagious plague. In the world of high finance and high society, privilege only protects you when you are winning. The moment you become a federal liability, you are excised from the herd without a single ounce of hesitation. Nobody stepped forward to defend him. Nobody offered to call their lawyers. They simply turned their backs, watching his social annihilation with cold, calculated self-preservation. Victoria Kensington, however, possessed a different kind of survival instinct. The matriarch of the Kensington family, who had just moments ago been demanding an annulment to protect her pristine aesthetic, suddenly realized that her family name was being publicly slaughtered. She shoved her way through the retreating crowd, her diamond necklace flashing under the emergency lights. Her perfectly contoured face was twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic fury. "Unhand my son immediately!" Victoria shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at the lead agent. "I am Victoria Kensington. This is an illegal harassment campaign. I will personally ensure that your entire department is bankrupted by litigation. We will sue the federal government for defamation for trespassing and for the emotional distress you have caused this family. You are making a monumental mistake." The lead agent stopped. He turned his head slowly, looking at Victoria with an expression of profound glacial disgust. He did not look intimidated. He looked deeply exhausted by her entitlement. "Save your legal fees for your son's criminal defense." "Mrs. Kensington," the agent replied, his voice carrying cleanly over the whispers of the crowd. "We are not making a mistake. We have ironclad evidence. We have documented 3 years of systemic wire fraud and the direct theft of millions of dollars from middle-class pension funds. Your son used stolen retirement money to pay for the offshore shell companies that funded this catering you are currently eating. We have every single wire transfer on record. There is no lawsuit that can unseal a federal indictment. Step back before I charge you with interfering in an active federal arrest." Victoria's mouth snapped shut. The threat of her own arrest was the only thing capable of piercing her armor. She took a slow, trembling step backward, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that her money could not buy her way out of this room. Aaliyah, who was still sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne, let out a long, wretched wail. She was not crying for Julian. She was mourning the absolute death of her billionaire fantasy. Calvin and Beatrice stood frozen near the kitchen doors, watching the social mobility they had sacrificed my childhood to achieve burn to ash in front of their very eyes. Julian thrashed against the grip of the two agents holding his arms. His perfectly styled hair was plastered to his forehead in sweaty clumps. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting frantically until they locked onto me. I stood calmly beside Princess Helena, my hands folded neatly in front of my emerald gown, projecting nothing but serene clinical observation. Julian snapped. The last remaining shred of his sanity evaporated. "She did this!" Julian screamed, straining against the handcuffs, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Spittle flew from his lips as he desperately pointed his restrained hands in my direction. "She is a vindictive bitch. She set me up. She planted the evidence because she is jealous of my wife. She faked the international transfers. She ruined me. You have the wrong person. Arrest her." He was grasping at straws, throwing wild, unhinged accusations, hoping that his sheer volume would be enough to cast doubt. He expected the federal agents to pause to turn their attention toward the black woman he was accusing. He expected his privilege to grant him the benefit of the doubt even while he was wearing steel bracelets. The lead agent simply tightened his grip on Julian's bicep, jerking him roughly toward the main exit. But the agent paused, casting a brief, respectful glance in my direction before looking down at the weeping, sweating CEO in his custody. "Miss Wilson provided the international tracking data this evening." "Yes," the agent stated, his voice loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear clearly. "And we thank her for her cooperation in securing the overseas accounts. But you have been under active federal surveillance for 6 months, Julian. We did not need her to plant anything." Julian froze, his mouth hanging open as the words registered. "You see," the agent continued, a dark, grim satisfaction bleeding into his tone, "your arrogance made you incredibly sloppy. You assumed your family name meant nobody was watching. Miss Wilson gave us the overseas routing numbers. But the domestic wiretap, the audio recordings of you moving the stolen pension funds into your personal accounts yesterday morning, that did not come from her. That came from someone inside your own house." The lead agent's words hung suspended in the opulent ballroom, heavy and suffocating like a thick layer of smoke. The domestic wiretap did not come from her. It came from someone inside your own house. Julian stopped thrashing against the cold steel of his handcuffs. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly around the room, scanning the faces of his parents, his groomsmen, his corporate executives. His chest heaved with ragged, panicked breaths. Who could have possibly bypassed his biometric security? Who had unlimited access to his private study at the Kensington estate? Who could have installed a recording device on his personal phone line? The lead FBI agent did not look at Victoria Kensington. He did not look at Richard. He slowly, deliberately shifted his imposing gaze downward. He looked directly past the puddle of spilled champagne and broken crystal. He looked straight at the bride. The mask drops. Aaliyah had been weeping hysterically just seconds prior, her face buried in her hands, acting the part of the devastated, innocent wife mourning the sudden loss of her billionaire fantasy. But as the heavy silence of the room stretched out, the manic sobbing abruptly ceased. It did not fade away slowly. It cut off instantly, like a switched-off machine. Aaliyah slowly lowered her hands. Her perfectly manicured fingers reached up to clutch the massive custom-strung South Sea pearls resting against her collarbone. She did not look like a heartbroken bride anymore. The artificial terror melted off her face, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating hardness that I had never seen her display before. She slowly pushed herself up from the wet marble floor, ignoring the heavy, ruined silk of her train. "You," Julian whispered, his voice a raspy, broken wheeze of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "You did this." The lead agent crossed his thick arms over his tactical vest, his expression a mask of professional disgust. We received a highly encrypted data dump exactly 3 weeks ago. The agent stated, his voice echoing clearly through the silent ballroom. It contained pristine copies of your private offshore ledgers. It contained crystal clear audio files of your phone calls with Cayman Island bankers. It contained photographs of your unredacted balance sheets. The whistleblower established a direct line of communication with the Securities and Exchange Commission, providing everything we needed to secure federal warrants. Richard Kensington staggered forward, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. "You," he barked, pointing a trembling, furious finger at Aaliyah. "You ignorant little gold digger. You had no idea what you were looking at. You cannot even read a standard balance sheet." Aaliyah tilted her head, her eyes flashing with a sudden venomous pride. "I can read just fine, Richard," she spat, her voice ringing out clear and sharp, cutting through the tension. "I found the leather-bound books locked in the bottom drawer of Julian's mahogany desk when I was looking for his spare platinum card. I saw the negative numbers. I saw the massive crippling debt. I saw that your precious son was absolutely broke and using stolen pension money to buy my engagement ring." The room collectively inhaled. The sheer brazenness of the bride casually admitting to rummaging through her fiancé's private safe to steal his credit card was staggering. "You were sinking," Aaliyah continued, turning her cold, remorseless gaze onto Julian. "You were a walking dead man. You lied to me, Julian. You promised me a private jet, a yacht, and a lifetime of limitless luxury. Instead, you were about to drag me down into a decade-long federal prison sentence. I was not going down with your pathetic sinking ship." "So you sold him out, Victoria?" Kensington hissed, her voice dripping with absolute revulsion, her aristocratic composure finally shattering. "You sold your own husband to the federal government." "I protected my investments," Aaliyah countered, lifting her chin defiantly. "I called my own lawyer. Do you know what the SEC offers for whistleblower tips that lead to successful prosecution of massive corporate fraud? They offer a bounty, a minimum of 10 to 30% of the recovered assets. Julian stole nearly $100 million. I secured a guaranteed payout of at least $10 million straight from the federal government, completely tax-free and perfectly legal." I stood beside Princess Helena, genuinely marveling at the sheer sociopathic brilliance of my sister's greed. Beatrice and Calvin had raised a monster, but they had raised a highly effective one. Aaliyah had realized the Kensington fortune was a mirage, so she actively orchestrated a federal raid to secure a multi-million-dollar government bounty instead. She planned to take the whistleblower money and file for a highly publicized divorce tomorrow morning, the FBI agent added dryly, shaking his head. She wanted the photo op of the grand society wedding and the federal payout. The escalation. Julian's face twisted into a mask of pure feral hatred. The man who had spent his entire life manipulating and exploiting others who believed his pedigree made him a god among insects had just been outplayed by a woman he considered nothing more than a pretty accessory. He had funded her lavish lifestyle, paid for her $1 million wedding, and she had fed him to the wolves to secure her own golden parachute. Julian let out a guttural, animalistic roar. The sound tore through his throat, a primal scream of absolute betrayal and violent, unhinged rage. He threw his entire body weight forward, lunging violently at his new wife. The heavy steel handcuffs dug brutally into his wrists as he swung his bound arms, trying to close his hands around Aaliyah's throat. "You treacherous, lying bitch!" Julian screamed, spit flying from his lips, his eyes wide and completely manic. "I gave you everything. I bought you everything. I will kill you. I will tear you apart." Aaliyah shrieked, stumbling backward awkwardly in her high heels, tripping over her ruined silk train, and falling hard against the edge of a catering table. The two massive federal agents reacted instantly. They tackled Julian mid-lunge, slamming their combined weight into his shoulders and driving him brutally into the polished marble floor. The impact made a sickening heavy thud. Julian thrashed and kicked, screaming profanities, struggling like a rabid animal as the agents pinned his face against the cold stone. "Get him out of here," the lead agent barked, stepping forward to shield Aaliyah from the chaotic, violent struggle. The agents dragged Julian up from the floor, pulling him backward toward the shattered ballroom doors. His custom tuxedo was torn, his shoes dragging uselessly against the marble. He kept screaming, his voice growing hoarse, echoing off the high ceilings, a terrifying, wretched soundtrack to the complete destruction of the Kensington Empire. Aaliyah stood behind the protective wall of federal agents, smoothing her hair, breathing heavily. She looked down at Julian struggling against the FBI and completely lost any remaining shred of decorum or self-awareness. "I deserve that money!" Aaliyah shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and entirely unfiltered. "I deserve every single penny of that government payout. Do you know what I had to endure for the last year? I had to put up with his terrible aesthetic. I had to listen to his boring, monotonous stories about venture capital. I had to pretend to like his horrible, snobby mother. I earned my $10 million. You owe me, Julian, the hook." The sheer audacity of her screaming about aesthetics while her husband was being dragged away to federal prison stunned the entire room into total, absolute silence. The elite guests stared at Aaliyah with a mixture of morbid fascination and pure, unadulterated disgust. She had successfully secured her money, but she had permanently obliterated her social standing. No one in high society would ever speak to her again. She was the bride who wiretapped her groom. I watched Beatrice. My mother was standing rigidly near the kitchen doors, her hands trembling violently. She was staring at her golden child, her perfect, beautiful Aaliyah. Beatrice had spent her entire life worshipping social status. She had drained my childhood savings, she had alienated me, she had compromised every moral boundary she possessed just to ensure her favorite daughter married into the highest echelon of the American elite. She had wanted to be accepted by the Kensingtons. She had wanted to belong. And now she was watching her golden child completely destroy that legacy. Aaliyah had not just orchestrated a federal crime scene at her own wedding, she had humiliated the family in front of the most powerful people in the country. She had behaved exactly like the ghetto uncultured stereotype Victoria Kensington had always accused them of being. Beatrice's grand social climbing fantasy was dead. The country club invitations would be revoked. They would be the laughingstock of the city forever. Something inside Beatrice finally irreparably broke. The lifelong illusion of perfection she had carefully maintained shattered into a million jagged, irredeemable pieces. Beatrice let out a low, agonizing wail. She marched forward, her face contorted with a rage I had never seen her display. She pushed past Calvin, shoving him out of the way with surprising force. She stormed directly across the dance floor, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble, marching straight toward her golden child. Aaliyah turned, her arrogant expression faltering slightly as she saw her mother approaching. "Mom," Aaliyah started, raising a hand. "Mom, tell them I did the right thing. Tell them I secured the bag." Beatrice did not speak. She did not offer comfort. She did not validate her daughter's sociopathic greed. Beatrice raised her right hand high into the air, her fingers rigid, her face burning with the fury of a woman who had just watched her entire life's work get flushed down the drain. She swung her arm with all her might, aiming a devastating, open-handed slap directly at Aaliyah's perfectly contoured face. The sharp crack of flesh striking flesh never came. Beatrice swung her hand with all the desperate, unhinged fury of a woman watching her entire social existence evaporate, but her palm never connected with Aaliyah's face. The lead FBI agent moved with a terrifying casual speed. He did not even look at Beatrice as he reached out and caught her wrist in midair. His thick fingers locked around her forearm like an industrial vice, stopping her strike dead in its tracks. Beatrice gasped, stumbling forward against the sudden, immovable resistance. She looked up at the agent, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and lingering aristocratic outrage, expecting him to defer to her status. "I highly recommend you keep your hands to yourself, ma'am," the agent stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed through the stunned ballroom. "You are currently standing in the middle of an active federal crime scene. Striking a cooperating federal witness will earn you an immediate trip to holding right alongside your new son-in-law." Beatrice snatched her arm back as if the agent's tactical glove had burned her skin. She shrank away entirely, the last remnants of her country club bravado shattering under the harsh, uncompromising glare of federal authority. Aaliyah let out a short, breathless laugh, her face still flushed with adrenaline and greed. She adjusted the ruined neckline of her custom silk gown, shooting her mother a look of pure, toxic triumph. She actually believed she had won. She believed she had outsmarted Julian, outsmarted the Kensingtons, and outsmarted the federal government. She stood up a little taller, completely misreading the situation, expecting the FBI agents to treat her as an ally. "I gave you everything you needed," Aaliyah said, addressing the lead agent, with a sickeningly sweet, cooperative tone. "The offshore ledgers, the audio files, the account routing numbers. I cooperated fully with the Securities and Exchange Commission. My lawyer assured me that my whistleblower status guarantees my protection and my percentage of the recovered funds. So if you are finished arresting Julian, I would like to go home." The lead agent did not move. He stood perfectly still, looking at Aaliyah with a chilling lack of emotion. He reached inside his tactical windbreaker and slowly pulled out a thick folded stack of legal documents printed on heavy official paper. "You are entirely correct, Mrs. Kensington," the agent said, his voice devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "Your cooperation was duly noted by the SEC, and your whistleblower claim will be processed through the standard bureaucratic channels. You can expect a hearing regarding your potential compensation in approximately 3 to 5 years, depending on the speed of the federal courts." Alia's triumphant smile faltered, her brow furrowed in sudden sharp confusion. 3 to 5 years, she repeated, her voice dropping an octave. "What are you talking about? I need my payout now. Julian is going to prison. I have a lifestyle to maintain." The agent unfolded the documents, holding them up so the harsh flashing lights from the police cruisers outside illuminated the heavy black federal seals stamped across the top. "What you fail to understand about massive corporate embezzlement is that the money you currently believe you own is not actually yours," the agent explained, speaking slowly, as if addressing a particularly stubborn child. "Every single dollar Julian Kensington spent over the last 3 years belongs to the defrauded teachers, firefighters, and municipal workers he stole from. The federal government does not allow individuals to keep assets purchased with stolen money, regardless of their marital status." Aaliyah took a slow, stumbling step backward. Her breathing hitched, her chest rising and falling in rapid, panicked spasms. "Wait," she stammered, holding her hands up defensively. "Pursuant to the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act and federal civil asset forfeiture laws," the agent continued, reading directly from the warrant, "we are executing the immediate seizure of all assets associated with Julian Kensington. This includes the frozen offshore accounts. This includes the fleet of luxury vehicles currently parked at his primary residence. This includes the massive pile of wedding gifts currently sitting in the coat check room of this hotel." Beatrice let out a strangled, horrific gasp. She had spent months curating that registry, demanding baccarat crystal and antique silver from her wealthy friends. Now the federal government was seizing it all as evidence of money laundering. Her dreams of being the ultimate high society mother-in-law, the woman who commanded the absolute envy of every woman at the country club, were completely dead. She was standing in a ruined ballroom, watching her legacy turn into a federal catalog of stolen goods. And finally, the agent said, lowering the paperwork and looking directly at Aaliyah's trembling hands, "It includes the deed to the newly purchased Hamptons mansion you attempted to leverage earlier. That property was bought entirely with stolen pension funds. The locks are being changed by federal marshals as we speak. You do not own a mansion, Mrs. Kensington. You own absolutely nothing." Aaliyah let out a high-pitched, keening sound of pure, unfiltered devastation. The color vanished from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. The $10 million bounty she thought she had secured was years away. The billionaire lifestyle she had manipulated, lied, and destroyed my childhood to achieve was officially erased. She was completely penniless. "Oh, and one last thing," the agent added, extending his open palm toward her. "The ring." Aaliyah physically recoiled, clutching her left hand to her chest, as if the agent had asked her to amputate her own arm. "No," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble pillars. "No, it is mine. He gave it to me. It is a gift. You cannot take my engagement ring. That 10-carat diamond was purchased with wire fraud funds 72 hours ago," the agent stated, his voice dropping into a register that brooked absolutely no argument. "It is stolen property. Hand it over immediately, or I will have you arrested for obstruction and the possession of stolen federal assets. Do not test me." Aaliyah looked frantically around the room, searching for a savior. She looked at the Kensingtons, who were already marching toward the exit, flanked by their own private security. She looked at her society friends who deliberately turned their faces away, refusing to make eye contact. She was entirely alone. Tears of absolute humiliating defeat streamed down her face. Her hands shook violently as she reached for her left ring finger. She grasped the massive, flawless diamond, the symbol of her ultimate victory over me, and slowly, agonizingly slid it off her finger. She dropped the ring into the federal agent's open palm. The heavy platinum jewelry landed with a pathetic, dull clink. The agent slipped the ring into a clear plastic evidence bag, sealing it shut with swift professional indifference. "Have a pleasant evening, Mrs. Kensington," the agent said, turning his back on her and marching toward the main doors to join the rest of the raid team. Aaliyah collapsed against the edge of the nearest catering table, sobbing with a profound, gut-wrenching despair. The fairy tale was over. The golden child was bankrupt, holding nothing but the ruined silk of her dress. Calvin and Beatrice stood frozen, their faces reflecting a terrifying mixture of shock, horror, and dawning realization. The foundation of their entire existence had just been atomized. Julian was gone. Aaliyah was destitute. Their social standing was a toxic, smoldering crater. And worst of all, they had funded this entire fraudulent spectacle by completely draining their own savings. They were broke, isolated, and publicly shamed. Then, like a drowning man spotting a piece of floating debris, Calvin's eyes locked onto me. I was still standing, perfectly composed, beside Princess Helena, watching the carnage unfold with absolute objective detachment. I was wearing an emerald gown that cost more than Calvin made in a year. I was standing shoulder to shoulder with European royalty. I was the chief advisor to a sovereign wealth fund. I was a billionaire by proxy, holding a level of power and influence they could not even comprehend. Calvin's posture changed instantly. The arrogant, demanding patriarch vanished, replaced by a desperate, sweating sycophant. He rushed toward me, dragging a shell-shocked Beatrice by the arm. Kendra, Calvin gasped, his voice trembling with a frantic, delusional hope. "Kendra, sweetheart, you have to fix this. You have to do something." I looked at him, my face a mask of smooth, impenetrable calm. I did not speak. I simply let his pathetic desperation hang in the air between us. Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes wide and manic, completely divorced from reality. She grabbed my forearm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. "Kendra, you have billions," Beatrice pleaded, her voice shrill and echoing in the emptying ballroom. "You just said it yourself. You own our house. You control the money. You have to help your sister. You have to buy Aaliyah a new house. She has nothing, Kendra. She is your flesh and blood. You have to protect her." The sheer, staggering audacity of the demand was almost impressive. After 20 years of emotional abuse, after stealing my college fund, after forcing me to sit by the kitchen doors like a servant, they were now demanding that I purchase a mansion for the golden child who had just ruined their lives. They believed that because I was successful, I was obligated to subsidize their failure. They believed their abuse was a down payment on my future wealth. I looked at Beatrice's grasping fingers. I looked at Calvin's sweating, desperate face. I looked at Aaliyah weeping over her lost diamonds. My expression remained completely unreadable. I did not yell. I did not express anger or sorrow or vindication. I simply reached into my custom emerald clutch. My fingers bypassed my phone and closed around a single neatly folded piece of heavy stock paper. I pulled the paper out of the clutch and held it up between us. I reached into the silk-lined interior of my custom emerald clutch. My fingers bypassed the sleek metallic casing of my phone and closed firmly around a single heavy piece of premium stock paper. I pulled it out, holding it between my index and middle fingers. The stark white rectangle was the only clean, unblemished thing left in the center of that ruined, chaotic dance floor. The flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles outside caught the sharp edges of the folded document as I held it suspended in the air. Beatrice stared at the paper. Her hand, which had just been raised to deliver a devastating blow to her golden child, was now trembling violently at her side. Her chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. She looked from the paper to my face, her eyes wide and terrified, completely unable to process this sudden, brutal shift in power. "Take it," I commanded. My voice did not echo with anger. It was perfectly level, carrying the flat clinical detachment of an executive closing a hostile acquisition. Beatrice flinched, but her lifelong conditioning to obey those who held ultimate authority finally kicked in. She reached out with shaking fingers, her diamond bracelets rattling against her wrist. She took the folded document from my hand. "Open it," I instructed. The entire ballroom watched in breathless silence. The elite guests, the society bloggers, and the federal agents who had lingered to secure the perimeter all stood perfectly still, completely captivated by the destruction of the Wilson family hierarchy. Beatrice slowly unfolded the heavy paper. The sharp, crisp rustle of the pages seemed incredibly loud in the dead, silent room. I watched her eyes track across the bold, printed header. I watched her perfectly manicured fingernails dig into the margins of the paper. I watched the last remaining drop of color drain completely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollowed-out porcelain doll. Her jaw went slack, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words that absolutely refused to materialize. "What is this?" Beatrice finally whispered. Her voice was thin and broken, entirely stripped of the haughty aristocratic resonance she had spent decades cultivating. "It is an itemized invoice," I replied, projecting my voice so that Calvin, Aaliyah, and every remaining guest in the room could hear me perfectly. "It is a highly detailed statement regarding the $50,000 you fraudulently transferred out of my custodial college savings account exactly 15 years ago." Beatrice swayed on her feet, clutching the paper to her chest as if trying to physically shield the numbers from the watching crowd. I did not simply print a bank statement. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. I had my wealth management team in Geneva run a full forensic analysis on that stolen capital. They adjusted the principal amount for 15 years of national inflation. They applied the standard market yield, assuming that money had been properly invested in a basic index fund instead of being squandered on designer handbags and private school tuition for your favorite daughter. They also tacked on a standard corporate penalty rate for unauthorized fund diversion. I stopped walking, standing mere inches from my mother. I looked down into her terrified eyes. The grand total at the bottom of that page, Beatrice, is precisely $487,212. You do not simply owe me an apology for stealing my future. You owe me nearly $500,000 of liquid capital. Beatrice let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She looked wildly around the room, searching the faces of her country club friends for any sign of sympathy. She found absolutely nothing. The women she had tried to impress for her entire adult life were staring at her with undisguised revulsion. The story of Beatrice Wilson stealing her own daughter's college fund to finance a fraudulent high society wedding was going to be the front-page scandal of the decade. Her social execution was absolute. "You cannot possibly expect us to pay this!" Beatrice cried out, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "We do not have this kind of money. We put everything we had left into this wedding. We remortgaged the house. Julian was supposed to be our safety net." "You are right, Mom," I said, leaning in closer so she could feel the absolute lack of mercy radiating from my words. "You do not have the liquidity. But I do own the house. I control the shell company that currently holds the deed to the suburban estate you sleep in every single night. Which means you have exactly 30 days to pay this invoice in full, or I am initiating formal eviction proceedings." The threat hit Beatrice with the physical force of a freight train. The loss of her house, the ultimate physical symbol of her suburban status, was the final death blow. She staggered backward, her knees buckling slightly as the reality of her total ruin crashed down upon her. Calvin could not stand the silence. He could not stand the complete destruction of his patriarchal illusion. He pushed past his weeping wife, his face a mask of sweating, desperate panic. He completely abandoned the authoritative regional manager persona he had hidden behind for years. He shrank physically, rounding his massive shoulders and holding his hands up in a placating, pathetic gesture of surrender. "Kendra, please!" Calvin pleaded, his voice shaking with a frantic, delusional hope. "You cannot do this. You cannot throw us out onto the street. We are your parents. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head. We are family." He stepped closer, attempting to cross the vast emotional chasm he had dug between us. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting nervously toward Princess Helena before focusing back on me. "We made mistakes, Kendra," Calvin begged, his voice dropping into a frantic whisper, as if trying to create a private bubble in the middle of a public disaster. "I admit it. I should have stopped your mother from taking the money, but we were desperate. We wanted Aaliyah to have a good start in life. You were always so smart, so capable, and so resilient. We knew you would figure it out on your own. We knew you did not need the money as much as she did. You were strong enough to survive it." The sheer staggering audacity of his excuse was breathtaking. He was actually using my competence, my lifelong struggle to survive their neglect, as a justification for their theft. My resilience was their excuse for cruelty. "Please, Kendra." Calvin continued, reaching a trembling hand toward me but stopping short of actually touching my dress. "You have to understand the pressure we were under. We are family, and family forgives. Family takes care of each other when things get impossibly hard. You are incredibly wealthy now. You have more money than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. $400,000 is absolutely nothing to you. You can afford to let this go." Calvin pointed a shaking finger toward Aaliyah, who was still cowering near the catering table, her ruined silk dress stained with dirt and champagne. "You have to buy Aaliyah a new house," Calvin demanded, his desperation temporarily overriding his common sense. "She is your sister Kendra. Julian is going to federal prison, and her whistleblower money will be tied up in court for years. She has absolutely nothing left. She will be homeless. You have to save us. You have to protect your sister." I stared at Calvin. I looked at the man who had sat at the head of the dining table for 20 years, demanding absolute perfection and delivering nothing but cowardice. I felt the last remaining tether of childhood obligation snap cleanly in half, vanishing into the cool, conditioned air of the ballroom. "Family does not steal from their children," I said, my voice dropping into a register of icy, absolute precision. Every single word was a calculated surgical strike designed to dismantle his delusion. Family does not quietly drain a teenager's bank account to buy vanity items for their favorite daughter. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, forcing Calvin to physically back away. Family does not tell their youngest child that she is too ugly and too socially inept to sit at the main tables. I continued, my voice ringing out clear and sharp. Family does not put single women by the swinging kitchen doors like second-class citizens. I gestured grandly toward the back of the ballroom where the catering staff had set up the overflow seating, where I had been banished just hours ago. "You wanted me out of sight tonight, Calvin," I said, stripping away his final defense. "You wanted me hidden away next to the garbage bins and the dirty dishes because I did not fit your curated country club aesthetic. You wanted me invisible so you could parade your golden child in front of billionaires without distraction. You watched Julian treat me like a common servant, and you smiled because you thought his wealth was your ultimate ticket to the elite class. You traded your basic integrity for an invitation to a society you do not even belong in." Calvin opened his mouth to argue, his face flushing with humiliation, but I cut him off sharply, slicing through his pathetic rebuttal before it could even begin. "Do not stand there and invoke the word family to me," I commanded, my tone radiating pure sovereign authority. "You lost the right to use that word the day you stood by and let Beatrice empty my account. You lost the right to my protection the minute you watched Julian's security guards slam me against a cinderblock wall without saying a single word in my defense. You made your choice 15 years ago, Calvin. You chose your golden child. You invested everything you had into her vanity, her greed, and her bottomless entitlement." I turned my gaze away from my broken parents and looked directly at Aaliyah. My sister was staring at me with a mixture of terror and overwhelming venomous envy. She finally understood that she had never been the winner. "Now you get to live with her," I stated, delivering the final undeniable verdict. "You have 30 days to vacate the property. If you leave a single piece of trash behind, if you damage the fixtures, or steal the appliances, I will have my corporate litigators sue you for property destruction." I highly suggest you start looking for a very small one-bedroom apartment. The absolute finality of my words hung heavily over the dance floor. There was nothing left to say. There was no negotiation, no bargaining, no tearful reconciliation. I had severed the cord completely, leaving them to drown in the consequences of their own making. I felt a sudden gentle warmth on my left shoulder. Princess Helena stepped forward, her presence instantly shifting the gravity in the room. She moved with the effortless grace of a monarch, completely unfazed by the emotional carnage surrounding us. She did not look at my parents. She did not acknowledge Aaliyah. They were entirely beneath her notice, mere peasants who had briefly interrupted our schedule. She placed an elegant gloved hand lightly on my shoulder. "My jet is waiting at the tarmac, Kendra," Helena said, her voice projecting a serene, effortless power that cut through the lingering tension in the ballroom. "We have a midnight clearance to depart, and Paris is beautiful this time of year." I did not offer Beatrice a parting glance. I did not give Calvin the satisfaction of a final argument. I simply turned my back on them. The movement was fluid, absolute, and completely devoid of hesitation. The sheer volume of the silence behind me was deafening. Every single pair of eyes in that room was pinned directly to my back. I could feel the desperate, chaotic energy radiating from the epicenter of the dance floor where my so-called family was finally suffocating under the crushing weight of their own monumental hubris. Aaliyah was gasping for air, her sobs echoing like a dying siren. She was kneeling in a puddle of spilled luxury, stripped of her 10-carat diamond, stripped of her billionaire status, stripped of the very identity she had sold her soul to acquire. Calvin was still babbling, his voice a pathetic, frantic drone of excuses and empty familial obligations. He was bargaining with the air, negotiating with a ghost. Beatrice was entirely catatonic. Her perfectly manicured hands were clenched so tightly around that itemized invoice that her knuckles were entirely white. The paper detailed exactly $487,212 of stolen capital. It was a physical manifestation of her complete, undeniable failure as a mother and as a human being. I turned on my heel, the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown sweeping elegantly across the shattered glass and ruined marble. I walked alongside Princess Helena, our pace completely unhurried, perfectly synchronized. We did not rush. We did not flee. We marched through the center of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom with the absolute sovereign authority of conquerors surveying a vanquished territory. The crowd of elite guests, the politicians, the venture capitalists, the hedge fund managers, immediately fractured and parted for us. These were the exact same people who had deliberately ignored my existence just 2 hours prior. These were the people who had sneered at my placement near the swinging kitchen doors, who had quietly mocked my lack of ostentatious jewelry, who had automatically assumed I was the tragic, defective sister of the flawless golden bride. Now they were physically stepping backward, pulling their designer tuxedos and couture gowns out of our direct path. They lowered their eyes as we passed. They were looking at me with a profound, visceral mixture of awe and absolute raw terror. They finally understood exactly who I was. I was not a charity case. I was the silent apex predator who had quietly funded their demise. I owned the ground they were currently standing on. Every single step I took toward those massive gold-leafed exit doors felt like a heavy iron chain snapping cleanly off my chest. I was physically and psychologically walking away from 2 decades of relentless systematic conditioning. I was leaving behind the awkward teenager who had hidden in her bedroom reading financial textbooks while her mother screamed about her lack of social grace. I was leaving behind the exhausted college student who had worked 3 simultaneous jobs to rebuild a stolen future while her sister flaunted designer handbags bought with my hijacked tuition money. I was shedding the suffocating skin of the scapegoat. The ledger was finally permanently closed. The debt was called in. The emotional transaction was complete, and the balance was entirely in my favor. We breached the main ballroom doors and stepped out into the grand foyer. The lobby of the hotel was a chaotic, shifting sea of dark tactical gear and panicked hotel management. We bypassed the primary coat check room, where a dedicated team of federal agents was currently cataloging Aaliyah's massive mountain of extravagant wedding gifts. They were systematically taping bright yellow federal seizure notices to the velvet boxes of Baccarat crystal, the antique silver serving platters, and the imported Italian linens. Beatrice's curated registry, her ultimate high society flex, was being boxed up as evidence of international money laundering. We did not break our stride. We stepped through the heavy revolving glass doors and out into the cool, sharp-biting night air. The front courtyard of the hotel had been transformed into an active, highly volatile war zone. The flashing red and blue strobe lights of half a dozen federal cruisers painted the pristine landscaping in violent, shifting colors. Local news vans were already screeching to a halt at the absolute edge of the police barricades, their massive satellite dishes extending upward like mechanical spiders. Reporters were aggressively shoving microphones over the tape, shouting rapid-fire questions, desperate for a glimpse of the Kensington collapse. Waiting for us at the absolute base of the grand stone staircase, perfectly positioned away from the flashing lights and the screaming press, was a massive, elongated Mercedes Maybach. The vehicle was completely blacked out, its heavy armor plating and thick bulletproof glass giving it the imposing, terrifying silhouette of a sovereign diplomatic tank. A man in a pristine dark suit wearing an earpiece stepped forward immediately, pulling open the heavy reinforced rear door with a respectful bow. Princess Helena slid into the plush custom leather interior with practiced, effortless ease. I followed her, settling into the deep, supportive seat. The driver slammed the heavy door shut behind us. The solid, mechanical thud of the vault, like door sealing, instantly severed the screaming sirens, the shouting reporters, and the chaotic roar of the outside world. We were encased in a perfectly silent, climate-controlled oasis of supreme, absolute luxury. The ambient lighting was a soft, soothing amber. The air smelled faintly of expensive cedar and rich new leather. The driver did not ask for a destination. He simply put the massive armored vehicle into gear and smoothly pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the chaotic flow of emergency vehicles. I leaned my head back against the plush headrest and slowly turned my gaze toward the tinted bulletproof glass. Through the heavy, darkened window, I watched the grand illuminated entrance of the Ritz-Carlton rapidly recede into the distance. A group of stern federal agents was aggressively escorting Calvin, Beatrice, and Aaliyah out of the secondary side doors, physically pushing them away from the main press gaggle. They stood shivering on the cold concrete curb, completely stripped of their dignity, stripped of their stolen wealth, and stripped of every single delusion they had ever possessed. Aaliyah was barefoot, holding her ruined custom heels in one trembling hand, her flawless makeup completely destroyed by tears and sweat. Beatrice looked incredibly small and impossibly old, clinging desperately to Calvin's torn jacket. Calvin was staring blankly at the flashing police lights, his jaw slack, his eyes completely hollow. They looked exactly like what they truly were: frauds. Empty, hollow parasites who had finally irreparably run out of lies to tell. The Maybach turned the corner smoothly, completely erasing them from my line of sight forever. They were no longer my problem. They were a closed chapter, a completed transaction, a terrible investment that I had finally successfully liquidated. Princess Helena reached forward and opened the sleek center console, revealing a heavily chilled bottle of vintage top-tier champagne and two flawless crystal flutes. She popped the cork with a soft, elegant sigh and poured the golden, bubbling liquid, handing a glass across the console. To Paris, Kendra Helena said, a slight, deeply knowing smile playing across her perfectly painted lips. To Paris, I replied, raising the heavy crystal flute. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The champagne was perfectly crisp, icy cold, and infinitely sweet. I looked straight ahead at the open road, the bright city lights reflecting off the polished hood of the car. I was entirely, completely free. The toxic, suffocating past was dead, and the future belonged exclusively to me. True family is defined by mutual respect, unconditional support, and genuine love, not by shared DNA or social status. This story highlights the destructive nature of golden child and scapegoat dynamics, demonstrating that parental favoritism and financial abuse ultimately destroy the very foundation of a family. Kendra's journey teaches us that true power comes from financial independence, emotional resilience, and the courage to set unbreakable boundaries. Walking away from toxic environments is not an act of betrayal, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Success achieved through honest hard work will always outlast the fragile illusions built entirely on manipulation, greed, and superficial appearances. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success? Share your story of resilience and independence in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more empowering narratives.